This is Nebraska Farmcast, a production of the Center for Agricultural Profitability in the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Department of Agricultural Economics. I'm Ryan Evans. Higher costs and lower inventory of fertilizer over the past year are continuing for farmers and ranchers in Nebraska. According to Dr. John Westra, professor and program leader with Nebraska Extension in the Ag Econ department here at UNL, fertilizer costs account for about 15 to 20% of total cash costs for corn production in the state, making this a major concern for producers as the new growing season approaches. He joins me now to discuss what's behind the price increases, what producers can focus on, and tools that are available to help them get a handle on their costs in the coming year. John, thanks for being here again.
Thanks, Ryan. I'm glad to be here.
And you have a new article that you've contributed to our Center for Ag Profitability website, cap.unl.edu, where you write that some farmers are reporting fertilizer prices that are as much as 300% higher than last winter. And you also describe delivery times as anyone's guess in many situations. So just broadly speaking, what factors are contributing to this, and have we seen anything like it before?
Sure. Thanks, Ryan. That's a great question. And, as with most things in economics, it's a function of both supply and demand. And so on the supply side, the supply factors that are affecting the situation currently have to do with, a couple things. Production issues related to fertilizer production, for example, supply chain issues related to inputs and outputs, some related to COVID, some not. You've got natural resource or input issues in fabricating or manufacturing fertilizers, and I'll get to that in a minute. And then distribution and transportation costs, which also increase the cost of any final goods sold. And then on the demand side, we've got a situation where because of stronger than anticipated prices for some of the goods that producers grow, that's increased the demand for the inputs to grow those goods. So, for example, corn and wheat, which are big users of nitrogen fertilizer, for example, the increase in prices that growers have seen over the last year or two have increased the demand for those inputs to grow those crops. So those are some of the factors on that come into play. And then the second part of your question, yes, this is happened at least one time that I'm familiar with. And probably for those with a longer memory, it's happened a few times because this is the nature of economic forces. They come in cycles. So, about 2007 to 2009, there was a similar situation with respect to fertilizers where strong demand, both domestically and globally, combined with lower fertilizer inventories, and then slow adjustment to increase production of those fertilizers, for example, in the U.S., led to significantly higher input costs for fertilizers. And then there's some other things at play here as well that are a little different, but not quite so different. And those have to do with uncertainty with respect to some of the producers of fertilizer on the international market. And we'll get to those in a minute, too.
Yeah, if you could, on the demand side, explain a little bit more about how the global demand for fertilizer right now is creating this situation here in the U.S., just how that's being impacted globally. It's important to understand.
Sure. Well, one thing to keep in mind is that fertilizer is a global market because about 45% or so of fertilizers that are produced in around the world are actually exported or transported away from the country in which they're produced. So that in and of itself creates a global market. And so we're not immune to the forces that affect other global markets. So, for example, what's happening politically in other parts of the world, that has an impact on the price. What's happening in terms of weather or climate, those have an impact on production or supply. Costs of production in other countries for producing those chemicals, those fertilizers, those affect price. You got transportation costs within those countries, and then you get transportation costs around the world to get them to wherever they're demanded. So all those have a factor or effect on the price that growers pay for fertilizer here in Nebraska.
And maybe a appropriate question that would be reasonable for a producer to ask. They see these perhaps production facilities around the country here. If the U.S. is a producer of fertilizers, then why can't we just keep the fertilizer that we produce here, for ourselves? How does the U.S. fit into that global market that you're talking about as a supplier?
Sure, that's a great question, Ryan. And like with a lot of things that are global commodities, the U.S. both produces a lot of it, but we also consume a lot of it. So we don't consume all that we produce, but we need more than we produce. So we export some. We export a little bit. We're a small player on the global market in terms of exporting of fertilizers because we use most of what we produce. So, for example, we export about 5% of the nitrogen that's traded globally, 12% of the phosphorus, and then 1% of potassium. So not a lot in terms of our participation as a provider to the global market, but we're definitely a large consumer globally.
And what are some factors in the actual production process of fertilizer that have been impacting prices right now?
Sure. Well, that's a story that goes back, at least in this situation, to at least last year. So let's think about a specific fertilizer that a lot of growers in Nebraska and the Midwest might be familiar with, anhydrous ammonia. So that's a nitrogen fertilizer, major component in production of corn and wheat and some other commodities grown here. It's produced by combining both nitrogen and hydrogen. And so hydrogen is basically created, let me rephrase that. Natural gas is the ingredient that's used in providing hydrogen in this synthesis process as the the co-element for the creation of anhydrous ammonia. But it's also the fuel or energy that's used to actually create the nitrogen fertilizer. So elemental nitrogen is combined with natural gas in both the production and as a fuel for the production, so that we get anhydrous ammonia, which is a form of nitrogen that growers can use in growing corn. So a couple things come into play here. You may remember about a year ago, it was mighty cold here and throughout the Midwest, to the point where significant spikes in the price of natural gas occurred throughout the Midwest and most of the country, but in particular the Midwest. Well, and the Midwest is also where, especially in the southern part of the Midwest, where a lot of nitrogen fertilizer is produced. So because there was a significant increase in demand, increasing price, the production of a lot of our nitrogen fertilizers was suspended or halted or shut down for a while. That put a crimp on inventories that were available for nitrogen fertilizer for this coming growing season. Then you've got disruptions because of Hurricane Ida, which also stopped production and disrupted the distribution for a bit. And then on top of that, you've got globally, because you remember nitrogen is like all these other commodities, we're talking about a global commodity. You've got factors that are affecting nitrogen natural gas prices globally that have affected production in Europe, for example, because they import a lot of their natural gas from Russia. The prices there have gone up, so the cost of fertilizer became, in some cases, cost prohibitive to produce, so they shut down factories for making it over in Europe. So another factor going into play there.
And you've written that while so much of this is out of control for farmers and ranchers, it's especially important to focus on what they can control or what they can track right now. So what's your advice to people out there as they prepare for this upcoming growing season?
Sure, Ryan. So I think one thing producers need to keep in mind is that when they're thinking about profit, there's kind of two sides of that equation. There's the revenue side and the cost side. So revenue is obviously yield times the output price that they receive. And then on the cost side, you've got the level of the inputs that are used times the price they're paying for those inputs. So let's look at cost side, for example, because there's a couple of levers here and a couple of levers on the revenue side that growers can control or influence to a greater or lesser degree. So key to knowing which levers to control is looking at figuring out what the economically optimal level of inputs and outputs are needed, as opposed to just focusing on maximizing yield. So that's a key thing for producers to keep in mind, is focusing on optimizing revenue and costs. So let's look at it this way. You've got a revenue, with revenue, you've got a output or yield influencer factor there. So you want to look at, as a grower, what are my yield goals? What are they with respect to my historic levels of production? How can I optimize that in a realistic way? And then what are the inputs associated with that to get to that level? So using some tools that the University of Nebraska has, for example, for fertilizer calculators, nitrogen calculators for corn and wheat and other crops that agronomy and others have developed to help them figure out what the optimal level of those inputs are, taking into account their soils, cropping history, manure credits, for example, and other things going, so that they get a realistic level of nitrogen and other fertilizers at the inputs that are going to optimize their profits. Part of that equation or determination is using a tool that we've got here, that we developed here in Center for Ag Profitability, called the Ag Budget Calculator, or ABC program. It's an online tool that helps growers identify what the specific input levels are in their specific cropping enterprises that they're going to be managing this coming year. And with that, it helps them determine the break-even costs for specific enterprises, even on specific fields. When they determine what their costs of productions are, that gives them the information they need to figure out what price they need to at least break even, and in other cases, make a profit. So it helps them in managing their operation, because they know what they've got to get to break even, and then they can look down the road to winter next year to look at what are the prices that are currently in the futures market. Is there a way they can forward contract or lock in one of those prices that they see to help them cover part of their production? So it's a risk management approach to managing profitability. We've got tools like the ABC program that'll help them in this situation that they're facing right now with increasing input costs and uncertainty with respect to other inputs as well. So the ABC program, we've got some training going on right now with Glennis McClure and others. So check out the Center for Ag Profitability website to find out more about that program.
Yeah, absolutely. And we will link to that calculator in the new article you have up on our website. We'll link there too to some other tools here at the University of Nebraska that you mentioned that if people want to go out and find those, CropWatch is a great resource, as always, cropwatch.unl.edu. And again, we'll link to those on our site, cap.unl.edu. And John, I just want to thank you for your time and comments on the podcast and for contributing another great article for us.
Thank you, Ryan.
Nebraska Farmcast is a production of the Center for Agricultural Profitability at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. For the latest research-based information and education resources to manage your farm or ranch operation, visit our website at cap.unl.edu. That's cap.unl.edu.